This hearing will come to order. The subcommittee meets today to receive testimony on the Department of Defense Aviation Safety Mishap Review and Oversight process. I'd like to welcome our distinguished panel of witnesses. We have Brigadier General David J. Francis, Commanding General of the Army Combat Readiness Center and Director of the Army Safety. Rear Admiral Mark Leavitt, Commander of the Naval Safety Center, and Major General John T. Rauch, Jr., Air Force Chief of Safety and Commander of Air Force Safety Center. I want to thank all of you for attending today, and we look forward to your testimony. This hearing continues the subcommittee's ongoing oversight of aviation, modernization, and readiness. As I've stated before, we are experiencing a crisis in military readiness brought on by years of continuous combat operations and continued deferred modernization, lack of training hours, and aging equipment. The alarming number of aviation accidents just in the past 3 months reveals how deep the damage goes and the magnitude of the task of repairing and rebuilding our capabilities. According to a recent Military Times investigation, aviation mishaps rose nearly 40% from fiscal years 2013 to 2017 and nearly doubled for some aircraft. Just this past weekend, an F-15 aircraft assigned to Kadena Air Base in Okinawa crashed while performing routine training maneuvers. Fortunately, the pilot survived. I believe this is the 6th Air Force-related aircraft accident in the last 12 months. Most concerning is that more U.S. military service members have died in aircraft mishaps over the past year than have died while serving in Afghanistan. One of those service members was a constituent of mine. Gunnery Sergeant Derek Hawley was a 33-year-old enlisted Marine, and he was killed while conducting training missions in a CH-53E helicopter that has been in service since the 1970s. Given this alarming trend, the hearing today will examine how the military services conduct investigations post-accident or mishap. We need to be assured the military services are adequately identifying the source and cause fast enough for us to be able to remedy them. We specifically want to better understand the process used by the department and the military services to answer these 3 fundamental questions regarding mishaps. What happened? Why did this happen? And what changes and recommendations are being taken to prevent this from happening again? The witnesses today are responsible for conducting investigations of service mishaps, identifying mishap causes and problems, and recommending mitigation actions. We have asked them to walk us through the steps that they use to determine the root causes of aviation mishaps, as well as how they communicate the results of these investigations to their senior leadership for action. It is my understanding that military accident and investigation processes include a thorough review of the mishap, aircraft circumstances of the incident, and personnel involved. Investigations of an automobile accident might use a similar process, but if repeated accidents are occurring at the same intersection, it seems most reasonable to examine the intersection itself for changes that need to be made, such as signage, lighting, lane markings, or the number and adequacy of the lanes at questions in the intersection. So I expect today that the witnesses will elaborate on how the military service safety centers collect and report mishap data to the Office of the Secretary of Defense as required by current policy to include data on the underlying factors that caused the mishaps. For example, I'd like to know whether the safety centers include information on human factors that contributed to the mishap, which according to DoD represent the leading cause of DoD mishaps. The hearing will also provide an opportunity to understand how lessons learned or recommendations from the outcomes of these investigations are informing changes to requirements for aircraft modernization in a timely manner. Additionally, the hearing should help members make a determination as to whether potential changes or reforms are needed in the overarching governance structure for the safety enterprise. Before I close, I also want to briefly touch on an issue of aging equipment and the undetermined causes and effects that may be evident pre-mishap, and with an awareness that some of those are identified and mishaps actually avoided. I've had recent discussions with the Secretary of the Air Force, and this particular issue is a major concern of not only the Air Force, but also the Department as well. Our subcommittee will be taking a closer look at this issue also, in that there are circumstances with aging equipment where we're identifying vulnerabilities that are being addressed that avoid mishaps, but nonetheless should be brought to the attention of this committee so that we can look at the overall enterprise of reviewing these equipment and how we fund and look at modernization and maintenance. In closing, I'm deeply concerned by the recent increase in these mishaps. While I'm traveling to military bases and spoken to pilots and maintainers, I've been more concerned also about morale and how this affects the military services and whether or not this military services are being too slow to respond. We have to do whatever it takes to ensure that our aircraft are safe and that pilots are getting the training that they need. And before we begin with our witness opening statements, I would like to then turn to my good friend, Nikki Songus, for her comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today to provide us with information on how each of the military services handles aviation mishap investigations and, more broadly, aviation safety programs, or aviation safety programs. The past few years and the statistics provided by the witnesses show that despite the best efforts of the services, the aviation safety community, and others, military aviation is an inherently risky endeavor. We ask our aviators to train for and conduct missions in bad weather, at night, at low altitudes, and under other high-risk conditions that no civil aviation aircrew would ever even consider attempting to operate under. However, this capability to operate at high tempo in all kinds of conditions while conducting complex missions is what differentiates the U.S. military from all others. Simply put, lots of nations have advanced aircraft, but only the United States has a capability to put it all together and use air power to achieve remarkably effective air power in all kinds of operations. So I think it is important to keep in mind that having the most capable and powerful military in the world comes at a price, one that is all too real for our pilots and their families. Realistic and complex training is required to achieve the kind of air power only the United States can provide. However, this realistic training is sometimes also dangerous, as we've been reminded of recently. While we would all like there to be zero accidents, it is important to remember that there is no, quote, free lunch, unquote, and no zero-risk way to train for war. We are fortunate that we have a military full of people willing to take these risks to protect us. Based on the testimony we received, it is clear that all the services take aviation safety seriously and have a strong cadre of professionals dedicated to this challenge. However, there is always room for improvement. In today's hearing, I'd like to hear how we can do even better and where Congress might be able to help. With that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent that non-subcommittee members be allowed to participate in today's hearing. After all subcommittee members have had an opportunity to ask questions, is there objection? Without objection, non-subcommittee members will be recognized at the appropriate time for 5 minutes. And also without objection, all witnesses' prepared statements will be included in the hearing record. General Francis, please begin.
Chairman Turner, Ranking Member Songus, and distinguished members of this committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to talk about aviation safety and for your continued commitment to our aviation forces. It's an honor to represent the Army leadership, the soldiers and civilians, and most importantly, the men and women of Army aviation who are deployed throughout the world supporting our nation today. The United States Army maintains the world's most modernized and well-trained aviation force of its kind, providing an asymmetric advantage to the joint force. Aviation is an inherently dangerous business, and we continue to make strides to reduce mishaps. Army aviation Class A mishap rates have steadily declined over the course of the last 35 years, with noticeable anomalies associated with major combat deployments. In FY07, during the surge in Iraq, the Army's manned Class A mishap rate was 2.39 per 100,000 flying hours. In the 10 years that followed, that rate fell to a low of 0.87 during FY16, with a 10-year average of 1.33. FY17 ended with a Class A manned mishap rate of 0.99, and the current rate for FY18 is 0.93. The mishap rates from FY16 to 18 year-to-date constitute the lowest 3-year period for Class A aviation mishaps in the last 35 years. Despite this improvement, the Army remains committed to aggressively driving our mishap rates down further. Commanders across the Army are committed to conducting rigorous training in the most demanding environments to ensure we are ready to conduct large-scale combat operations in the most demanding conditions. The Army Combat Readiness Center mishap investigation and analysis capability is also crucial to meeting this goal. The Combat Readiness Center maintains a cadre of expertly trained accident investigators ready to deploy on a moment's notice anywhere in the world. They are tasked with determining the root cause of our most severe mishaps and reporting lessons learned for Army-wide distribution, all with the aim of future mishap prevention. These teams follow a very deliberate and methodical process to answer three fundamental questions: what happened, why it happened, and what we're going to do about it. The follow-on collective analysis of these mishaps is also crucial to determining strategies to prevent future mishaps. The Army's efforts to reduce aviation mishaps is an ongoing process. We must train to the highest standards in the most demanding conditions to meet future threats, while systematically drawing from and disseminating lessons learned. We must remain aware of and mitigate inherent aviation risks, but must avoid becoming risk-averse, or we will pay the price in our next conflict. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Tsongas, thank you again for your continued support of Army soldiers, civilian, and families, and I look forward to your questions.
Admiral Leavitt.
Chairman Turner, Ranking Member Tsongas, distinguished members of the subcommittee, I am grateful for the opportunity to appear before you today. The aviation mishap investigation, review, and oversight process is an important topic. Any loss of aircraft, aircrew, or maintainers negatively affects the lethality and resilience of our Navy Marine Corps team. Our goal is to have zero preventable mishaps, but for those that do occur, we rigorously investigate and learn from them to help prevent them from happening again. You have heard in previous testimony that physiological episodes are the #1 safety priority in the naval aviation community. I wholeheartedly agree. This is a challenging issue, but there are many developments taking place to make our aircrew safer. Reporting is up because awareness is up. As we thoroughly investigate every single suspected physiological episode, we do that so we can continue to understand them, improve technological advances, and human factors modification already in progress. In addition to our work on physiological episodes, it is important to know that we have detailed procedures in place to immediately investigate all aviation mishaps, even those that don't make the headlines. After investigating mishaps, hazard reports, and near-miss reports, we immediately disseminate those lessons learned from each one to the respective community of interest. Furthermore, high-velocity learning is central to the fleet safety culture. As such, we reaffirm at every opportunity the importance of and requirement for units sharing these lessons learned and risk mitigation techniques with others. To enhance the important work that we do responding to and investigating mishaps, the Naval Safety Center is undergoing some major internal organizational improvements. These initiatives align with Secretary Mattis's vision of innovation and delivering performance at the speed of relevance. Based on the findings in the comprehensive review and the strategic readiness review, we're working with fleet and type commanders to aggregate manning, training, and other data sources so we can conduct complex modeling and analytics. This will allow us to provide a holistic picture about the overall health and risk level of units. Such analysis will provide preventative solutions that naval leaders can use to make decisions that reduce unnecessary exposure to risk. Getting this right is of vital interest to our Navy Marine Corps team. Our people are our greatest asset, and keeping them safe is our responsibility. We owe them nothing less. I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Rauch.
Chairman Turner, Ranking Member Tsongas, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to provide an update on the United States Air Force Aviation Safety Program. I would like to let you know that safety is a top priority for the Air Force in everything we do, especially in aviation. We understand flying operations carry inherent risk, but we strive to eliminate or mitigate these risks to the greatest extent possible. We owe this commitment to our airmen and to the nation. Our view is that one mishap is one too many, and the focus of our safety programs is mishap prevention. We have numerous efforts in place to identify and mitigate hazards well before a mishap occurs. However, when we do have a mishap, we strive to learn everything we can to prevent similar occurrences in the future. It's important to stress that we thoroughly investigate mishaps, identify root causes, in order to formulate recommendations. Indeed, these recommendations are the legacy of a mishap investigation. We actively manage and track these mishap recommendations into closure. We've had success with this approach over the years, and our long-term aviation mishap rates have generally declined, but we never lose sight of the need to make adjustments to ensure we stay on top of any emerging hazards or trends. I also want to highlight that working together with the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the other services is an important part of what we do. Our safety centers and leaders constantly share information to ensure synergy and collaboration. In the end, we want to ensure effective safety programs across the entire department to safeguard our people, protect resources, and preserve combat capability. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Gentlemen, thank you for your comments. I mean, we certainly all understand that you're committed. We understand that mishap rates might not reflect casualty rates. Everybody can open the newspaper and look at the news stories that are occurring, that we have a unbelievable amount of risk that our service members are currently undertaking as a result of these mishaps. We understand what you must do, but this hearing is about, are you? So I guess the first thing I would like to ask is, give us an example of something that you're learning. Tell us something that you all outlined the process that we expected that you would be undertaking. But give us an example of something that we're learning as a result of the processes that you've been undertaking. General Rauch, I'll begin with you.
Thank you, sir. One example of one within the last year is we had a mishap with an engine and one Class A, and once they tore into the root cause, they noticed that there was a defect with the actual blades in the engine. So went back, discovered that it was a manufacturing process, and then real quickly, time critically, went across the fleet, ended up inspecting 15,000 different fan blades as of a couple weeks ago, noticing that 163 of these were bad and removed them from the system. That's the way we do it with technology. Now, of course, that creates a demand on the maintainers or whoever is doing that inspection. Has to do with aircraft availability and that sort of thing. We also do the same thing whether it is an operational requirement or something about the way the aircraft itself is maintained.
Admiral?
Chairman, I'll use the example of T-45 and the physiological episodes that we were incurring with that airplane. Initially, gathering the data took a little bit of time. We established the physiological episode action team led by a flag officer, instituted a 3-part form that allowed us to collect data. And as we dug down into specifically T-45, what we learned that it was a gaseous oxygen problem that was getting different volumes to the crews in the front and the back. Working with NAVAIR, NASA, and some other entities, we discovered that there were some design issues with the piping in the system and some other things. We increased the idle power of the engine when it sits at idle to keep the volume of air going to the O-box generation system up. And we're in the process of designing a alternate oxygen supply system that is out for request for, to be installed in the airplane. It looks like down the road in the next fiscal year.
General Francis.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. I think the biggest thing that the Army has learned over the course of the last year is that an in-depth study of our lesser accidents, in other words, Class C mishaps, has provided to be very revealing. What we often realize is that it's a matter of inches or seconds that make the difference between a Class C or a Class A, which is a more severe mishap and oftentimes with fatalities. Our study of that has brought us to the production of what we call the near-miss brief, where we take a Class C mishap and using our flight data recorders, we can recreate the flight and have a conversation about what might have been different that would have made that catastrophic and what procedures and processes and training can we implement to prevent those from happening in the future. We are currently conducting that brief across all Army Aviation, active, Guard, and Reserve, and it's being very well received in the field, and we think it's going to make a big difference. Thank you.
So when we look at these incidences, the commonality is that things are falling out of the sky. But when you look at the instances themselves, are you finding commonality? What types of things, as you're looking at these mishaps, are evident and that we need to be aware of as we look to what we're advancing for the committee's oversight? General Francis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The U.S. Army, our causal factors have remained relatively constant. And that is that human factors generally account for between about 76 and 80% of our mishaps. Material causes between about 15 and 19% of our mishaps. So what that allows us to do is go in and further refine what those human factors are, and that's across the DoD effort to do right now, and then really go after those primary human causal factors, specifically as relate to training that we can get after to prevent future mishaps.
Admiral?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our data is very similar with the percentage of both human factors and material failures, and then there's another 5% that is yet to be determined due to ongoing investigations. We're doing the same thing when it comes to human factors. The human factors coding allows us to do exactly the same thing that the Army is doing and get after those specific traits that we need to either change publications for, change tactics and procedures for, or do some training adjustments as we move forward. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. Our the numbers for us are about 75 to 80% as well that are human factors, and doing similar things as the other services. And one of the things we're trying to do is get access to potentially other data from other sources that aren't in sort of normal safety chains as well, to see if there's some correlations between those things as well as the human factors that we're seeing. But so far it is the human factor identification as well as the same rates as it relates to the system, sir.
General Rauch, I understand the Chief of Staff of the Air Force has directed all wing commanders to conduct an operational safety review, and part of the review requires a review of the backlog of mishap safety investigation recommendations, which have not been closed. Could you give us an update on the status and how that process works? And then the same question for the others after you finish. Once you come up with recommendations, what is the oversight process for determining that recommendations are implemented? And what happens when there's a backlog, as apparently the Air Force is experiencing?
Thank you, Chairman. If I could take the second question first. So we get recommendations that come in from mishaps, average just under about 100 a month. And so there'll be individual OPRs that are identified and responsible for those. And so whether it's across the different major commands, you can imagine if they're material ones, a lot of those belong to Air Force Material Command. Policy and oversight at the major command levels would belong to the operating levels, and then some things would be on the air staff that's general policy. And that kind of accounts for most of the recommendations that aren't local in nature that a wing commander would take care of. It's isolated to themselves, because we try and figure it out broad spectrum, obviously internal things to a wing that could take care of. That process runs yearly. The different MAGCOMs have a different way of handling it. We, internal to the Safety Center, once a week are pulling down what those numbers look like, what the timeline is that people are actually reviewing them. And if you dig into one of those recommendations, it might be a significant material solution to something that takes years to field. And so that mishap recommendation will stay open, and we will track those through. And so that's one of the things we spend time on. Other ones will be overcome by events, and the other part is safety investigation boards are not restricted from what they recommend, and so they can really stretch beyond potentially what's currently available, and that will be out there, and there'll be something that comes to fruition. An example of that might be the auto ground collision avoidance system that was out there for a while and that has been implemented on the F-16s. Now we're bringing it forward on the F-35s, as well as on the F-22, a different system. But anyway, so that sort of thing might be a recommendation. It might come from that, and then it takes many years to implement. If we go back to the operational safety review, which was the first part of the question, sir, you're exactly right that in May, the chief directed that they actually have a stand down across all the wings, that we do an operational pause, that we take time to look at 7 different categories he asked them to do. He empowered the local commanders to clearly talk about the different issues that they're interested in and asked for that feedback. The intent was not to have the Air Force as a whole or the major commands fix the local problems or to highlight the local problems, but to give them a chance and opportunity to talk about the risk that's out there and highlight those things that upper levels can take care of. The interim feedback we're getting is exactly that when the wings got together, and the active duties have been complete, the Guard and Reserve have been given to the 25th of June to make sure that they can fit it within the schedules that they have on the weekends, the Guard weekends and that sort of thing, the drill periods. So we're getting interim feedback back, and it talks about some of the things that are going on, both local, MAGCOM, and Air Force level that they'll go after and tackle. Some success stories that are buried in there of things that they've been able to do, and some other concerns that have to do with aging aircraft, manning levels, experience levels, and that sort of thing. But it's still interim, and it's still coming in, and so I'm not sure what all we will hear from that. We'll bind that together, look to see what sort of actions, things that we can take care of at the half level, sort of policy issues, and there might be larger, broader things that will drive an initiative that we'll have to do, sir.
Thank you, Admiral.
Mr. Chairman, every mishap investigation, when they determine causal factors, has recommendations that go along with those causal factors, and the recommendations either from a hazard report or a safety investigation report become either mishap recommendations or hazard recommendations. The majority of them, 65% of those, are aligned to NAVAIR because many of it is engineering or parts issues going forward. That list is maintained by the Naval Safety Center, and then it is kept up to date on a weekly basis through the aircraft controlling custodians. That would be Commander Naval Air Forces Pacific, Commander Naval Air Forces Atlantic, Assistant Commandant for the Marine Corps for Aviation, and things along those lines. Right now, in the last 90 days, there were 140 MISRECs or HAZRECs closed, and there were also 74 added in the 90 days. So it's a ongoing effort to stay in front of those things. As General Rauch alluded to, sometimes there are long-term design issues or parts that have to be bought. And again, the mishap boards are not constrained in the Navy and Marine Corps as well from putting things out there that future technology may be able to solve. So some of them do stay open for long periods of time.
Thank you. General Francis.
Mr. Chairman, the U.S. Army Combat Readiness Center maintains what we call the recommendation tracking system. And that's where we take all the recommendations that come from mishap investigations, and we assign those recommendations to the appropriate agency in the Army to deal with that particular subject. On a weekly basis, the general officer leadership from across what we call our aviation enterprise, those that are responsible for training, doctrine, for sustainment, for acquisition, special operations, and dealing with the Army staff, we meet weekly and discuss the most important of these things. As you know, depending on the urgency of the recommendation, will determine the speed at which we resolve that recommendation. Some of them might be fairly simple to do, others might be more complex, involving a material solution or a revisement of training or documentation, training publications, etc., that might cause us to go a little bit longer. But we do, in fact, track those and make sure that they have the right leadership emphasis across the Army Aviation's leadership on a weekly basis.
Ms. Songus.
Thank you. In reading the materials leading up to the hearing, I see that the mishap notification and reporting process is governed by each service's internal regulations, which outline responsibilities, timelines, reporting, and safety investigation requirements for each type of mishap. I'd like to ask more about the mishap boards that clearly have such responsibility that each service assembles to respond to these incidents. So are there standing boards or teams that respond to major mishaps, or are the boards assembled on an ad hoc basis depending on the type of aircraft, the circumstances surrounding the incident, and other factors that may be taken into account? And I'll start with you, General Rauch.
Thank you, ma'am. So to start at the back, we do not have standing boards, so you're exactly right. We have board presidents that are previously trained ahead of time and throughout the organization. And so when a mishap happens at a location, they'll stand up an interim safety board that will preserve the evidence and take care of things, while the major command that's responsible to be the convening authority will assemble the board. That board will have that board president that's trained to do that. We'll have an investigation officer that's been trained to do investigations. Both of these may or may not have done investigations in the past. We'll have a pilot member, depending upon whatever airplane it is that's involved. We will have a medical professional, and then whatever else the team really needs to kind of round out that board. And then as time goes, if they need more help, we'll get them access to that help. Meanwhile, there'll be a person from the Air Force Safety Center that is responsible to integrate with that team and get them the support they need. And on some of the boards, they're actually a member of that board. It really depends on the makeup and the mishap that occurred, ma'am.
The board presidents are drawn from where?
They're normally drawn from the MAGCOM in which the accident occurred. So if it's Air Combat Command and they have a mishap, then they'll be the ones that will normally draw a colonel from somewhere across that group unless there's fatalities, in which case it'll be at least a 1-star that'll be chosen to be the board president. So what we end up doing is training a lot of board presidents every year to be prepared in case something happens.
So you train them in anticipation that there will be incidents?
Yes,
And
ma'am.
is there a standard protocol for that training?
Yes, ma'am. It's actually, the training is run by the Safety Center for the Board President's course, and we do it in Albuquerque, but we also do it on the road, sometimes to send a couple instructors on the road. And they will actually do the instruction for both the Safety Investigation Board and the Accident Investigation Board. They get the same sort of training together. And so we do that for the group commanders and wing commanders, but then we also do that for other people that may be selected, ma'am.
Admiral?
Thank you, ma'am. In the Navy Marine Corps case, we can have either standing boards or boards that are appointed by the controlling custodian when a mishap occurs. The controlling custodian is the convening authority. Membership at a minimum includes a senior member, either a naval aviator or naval flight officer. If it's a class alpha, it's an 05 or above, preferably outside the reporting chain when it comes to the mishap. All other mishaps, the senior member has to be a senior to the pilot and commander or mission commander of the aircraft that was involved. There's an aviation safety officer who's professionally trained in aviation safety at our School of Aviation Safety down in Pensacola, Florida. There's a flight surgeon to deal with aeromedical issues. There's a maintenance representative and an operations representative. Just like the Air Force, other specialties as required, and we do rely on technical support from the outside, from original manufacturers and NavAir. But it's important to note that those people are not directly members of the board, they're advisors to the board.
Do you have a similar training program for those that might be tasked with leading the effort?
With leading the effort, no, ma'am. We have aviation safety officers who are the aviation safety experts. They've been trained at our School of Aviation Safety. Our COs and wing commanders also attend a 2-week course down at the Aviation Safety School to give them a top-level view of what to expect if they are appointed senior member of a board.
And since you have both ad hoc and those that are created are standing, have you compared results or processes between the two different approaches?
Anecdotally, ma'am, I would have to say from the reports that I've seen that have been done by both over my career in the Navy, I have seen no difference in the rigor that's put into those investigations.
Thank you. General?
Thank you, ma'am. At the U.S. Army Combat Readiness Center, we do have 4 standing teams, 2 ground and 2 air, that consist of a school-trained board president and recorder. The rest of that team is built much like the other services, depending on the type of mishap and the expertise that is in fact required. What they bring to that is they are experts at accident investigation, and the process is to do that. We do have a formal accident investigators course that we do out of Fort Rucker, Alabama, that all of our investigators are required to go through. In addition to our standing boards, we do train other accident investigators throughout the Army in the event that we are committed, another mishap occurs, and we do have other school-trained folks to conduct our mishap investigations. And we have the same board makeup that the other services have as well in terms of the medical and technical and all the other disciplines that may be required in a particular mishap.
And again, have you seen the benefit of one versus another, the ad hoc versus the standing?
So the accident investigators that we have at the Combat Readiness Center, that's what they do. That's all they do. They are very, very good at what they do. The completeness of the reports is the quality of the reports tends to be a little bit better, quite frankly, than the rest of the field. However, we do a quality control check on all accident reports that come up from the thing. But their expertise in that particular area makes them better than just about anybody else.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question about how you're responding to families as these events are happening. So I believe keeping faith with the families of our military aviators is obviously critical whenever there is an accident. And family members do deserve to know as much as possible, as soon as possible, about how their loved ones were injured or lost in an event. So how are families integrated into the investigation process? And we'll start with you, General.
Ma'am, the purpose of the Safety Investigation Board, the primary purpose of that is mishap prevention. And there are some aspects of that that go back quite a ways that end up with taking safety privilege from privileged communications that may come from an aircrew member or somebody else. And so what the Air Force has done is at the same time, we do a separate board by the individuals trained, the board presidents are trained for us the exact same way, called the Accident Investigation Board. And so within 2 days of that standing up, they plan on talking, the normal routine is to go talk to the families, to make sure they understand the process from the very beginning. Depending upon where the mishap occurred, the families may have an unusual request or something that they can meet there. And then they keep the family informed, and it is that Accident Investigation Board that is actually releasable to the public. And what we do is they're the ones that are first advised. So once it's signed off and approved, that board president offers to go brief those family members, let them know what was discovered, answer any questions before it's released to the public, because obviously we agree with you and think that they should be the first ones to receive that information, ma'am.
So essentially, they're first told the process, but it may be some time before they're actually informed of what happened.
Yes, ma'am. It'll take some time to go through and determine exactly what did happen. Yes, ma'am.
And does the seriousness of the accident play a role in what you're able to tell and when?
Sometimes it's the nature of the accident maybe more than the seriousness. Obviously, if you're talking about families of injured or deceased members, those are the worst type of accidents, obviously, because we've lost life or injured individuals. So a lot of those, each one is different, but a lot of those will have that time dynamic that there's something probably complicated that happened that takes a while for that investigation to occur, ma'am.
Admiral.
Yes, ma'am. Similarly, there will be parallel investigations that go on, the safety investigation to determine the causal factors and prevent reoccurrence. The other investigation that goes on is the JAG manual investigation, which assigns accountability. The Safety Center does not directly interface with family members or of someone who is injured or involved in an accident. If there's a fatality, the Casualty Assistance Call Office, which is local to the command that had the fatality, will notify the family members and things along those lines. Before the JAG manual is released, the family does get a brief, if the family member desires a copy of the safety investigation report, they can generally contact our FOIA office for freedom of information and obtain a redacted copy due to some of the safety privilege information that would be in the report that we would not want, that is important to getting to the bottom of the investigation and finding out the causal factors.
But they would have to go through that FOIA process before they would be privy to some of those details.
The specific details of the accident, ma'am?
Yes.
If it was safety privileged and it was factual, yes, they would go through the FOIA process to get that information. Yes, ma'am.
General.
Ma'am, obviously, as with all the services, the Army is very, very concerned about our families, especially in a time of crisis if there's a fatality and so forth. And the Army has multiple mechanisms to help families through those times that are outside of the safety arena. Within the safety arena, just like the other services, we have the safety investigation and what we call the AR, Army Regulation 15-6 investigation, which is the legal investigation. At the completion of those investigations, the safety investigation will share all factual data with the 15-6 investigation, and that is the 15-6 is the one that would get outbriefed to the family members. The family members, much like the other services, can request the report that's not safety privileged through the FOIA process, but other than that, the factual data would already have been transmitted to them through the 15-6 that we could share from the safety side.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Chairman. Appreciate it. We thank our three safety experts here and leaders for being here. I was trained to be a safety officer, by the way, Ms. Angus, so I did 2 accident board president duties myself and briefed the families. I thought it was one of the most challenging jobs, but when you find a root cause and can compassionately brief a family, it's also, I would say, rewarding and something you never forget. So I really appreciate what you all do, and I know firsthand the importance of your jobs. And also, I'd like to say firsthand, I know the professionalism of Major General Rauch over here, who I've worked with on multiple occasions, so good to see you here. We had 80 fatalities last year from routine operations. We think some of that, can't say all of it, but some of it goes back to underfunding, or under-resourcing our training, our maintenance, stretching people out too thinly in some of our service areas. So last year we plussed up funding by 10% to the NDAA. This year we held that even with inflation. And it is our hope that through better funding of our operations and training and maintenance, that we're gonna see some improvements in our safety record in the coming years. And that's one of the motivators for us to fund and improve the funding of our military. One of the things that concerned me was I was on an aircraft carrier over Christmas in the Persian Gulf, and the skipper of the aircraft carrier said that the average fighter pilot got 11 hours a month training prior to deployment. And then I know in the Air Force, there are some communities that are getting the same kinds of flying hours. And I think it's about 1/3 of what we used to do in the 90s, or I should say maybe 1/3 of optimal training before we deploy people and put them in combat. So I'd like to just get your all sense, are you getting enough flying hours right now with your various crews? I know it may depend on what MDS or what type aircraft out there, but we'd like to get your feedback. Are we given enough flight hours? What is the relationship between routine flying hours and training versus safety? And I would appreciate your feedback. And we'll start left to right. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. Our data do not indicate a correlation between the execution of flight hours and mishaps. We just cannot correlate that data one to the other. What we can say is that our data does indicate that the Army Aviation has experienced the biggest spike in Class A mishaps in conjunction with major combat operations. So when we went to Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Bosnia and Kosovo, Iraq and Afghanistan, during each one of those conflicts, especially during the initial stages, we experienced a major spike in Class A mishaps. And so where we are focused right now is making sure that we are doing that hard training that is going to be required to meet a peer or near peer threat, which will drive us to lower flight profiles and increase risk to prevent that next spike from occurring when and if we do get called to the next combat engagement.
So what I hear you saying, if I may, if you're under training, that adds risk in the early stages of combat. If you undertrain.
Yes.
And so you're seeing that direct correlation. Thank you, Admiral.
Thank you, Representative, for the question. Again, the Navy Marine Corps team has not been able to draw a direct correlation between a lack of flight hours and increase in mishaps. What we have discovered through a study that was done recently was a change in op tempo from very high op tempo to very low op tempo, or very low op tempo to very high op tempo. That's where we see the greatest increase of risk. Units that remain in low op tempo and they're able to look at that low op tempo, mitigate risk ahead of time, and same when we're in the high op tempo area. We've discovered it's the fluctuation between the two is when we see the increased level of risk out there going forward.
General Rauch.
Congressman, we went, and of the recent ones being investigated, of course, went back to look at the individual pilots to see the amount of flying they'd had in the last 30, 60, and 90 months. What we did not see was a correlation between those that have had a lot or a little as it relates to the Class A's within recent times. Now, clearly those numbers, when we're fortunate, are in the small numbers, and so you end up with small number dynamics if you're not careful. And so we don't think that it proves that there's no correlation, but at least from the individuals that we have had that have been in the mishaps, that has not been something that we can directly correlate to the number of mishaps we've had across the different years, across the last couple of years. We were looking to compare that sort of thing. We are tracking the number of total flight hours we fly as a service, look at that as it relates to the rates, so we can kind of judge years to years. Like you say, fatalities at different rates across the different years. We actually looked for last year. For us, the number was less than it was this year, and so we do track those closely, but haven't got the connection between the two, sir.
This may be a better question for the A3 or the G3 or N3, whatever service it may be, but when you agree that maybe 11 hours a month would be too low, and that does induce risk, particularly maybe for the pre-combat or early phases of a combat. So maybe I'll just come back. Are we getting enough flight hours for safety?
Congressman, I'll tell you the one thing we're looking at that from a safety point of view is if we're getting inadequate flying time, then if there's inadequate training, then there's some concern. Is that a hazard that we are now having to deal with? And then how do you mitigate that hazard and how do you create that risk? And definitely reduced flying hours below a threshold that would cause that. We don't have a number that on the safety community that we're using, but obviously, as you say, the 3 is the one that's looking at that. But from our point of view, we are worried about the risk if you're not flying enough.
Okay. Any more comments? Maybe one follow-up. Go ahead, General. You're going to...
Certainly, sir, there's a risk if we don't train to standard. The aviation training strategy for the U.S. Army says that we shoot for 14.5 hours per crew per month to attain battalion-level collective proficiency. And that is what we're going for as we transition to large-scale combat operations, and the Army is working towards funding that or getting us to closer to those levels than we are currently.
Okay, thank you. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Carvajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the Navy's testimony, I found something a bit disturbing. On page 3, there is a chart showing the Marine Corps Class A mishap rate over the past 10 years. The Army, the Air Force, and the Navy show roughly a flat rate of Class A events over that time period. But as shown in the testimony, the Marine Corps rate has more than doubled between 08 and 17 fiscal years, should I say. This data appears to show that the Marine Corps has a serious aviation safety problem. What is going on with this situation? When you look at the comparisons, what seem to be the top reasons for this problem? Is it funding? Is it old aircraft? Is it the lack of training? What is it? And what is the plan to get to this issue? If you could outline maybe what that plan to move forward is, I would greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for the question, sir. Over a 10-year average, the Marine Corps is within normal rates with a couple aberrations, as we talked about. Last year was a tough year for the Marine Corps with the number of personnel that we had lost along the way. One of the efforts that we're pursuing at the Naval Safety Center right now to look across greater data streams instead of just mishap and hazard reporting data. We're working internal with our organization to stand up a knowledge management safety promotion directorate that is going to aggregate data that includes operational data, manning data, and many other things. We're hiring data scientists and some other folks. We're working with the Army Analytic Group to come up with some complex modeling and deep dive analytics that will be informed by subject matter experts who are operators of Navy and Marine Corps aircraft. And hopefully from that we can become much more predictive in discovering what could come in the future for occurring mishaps. Getting left of the bang, as I like to put it, sir.
Is there an actual plan to achieve that and timelines?
Yes, sir, there is. It actually came out of the Strategic Readiness Review and the comprehensive review, although those were focused on the tragic ship mishaps last year. Aviation safety is taking lessons from those, and we're funded both in 18, 19, and 20 to increase our staffing and manning. We have a contract with Army Analytics Group right now. We just hired a data scientist contract at the Safety Center, so within this year, I would say by the end of this year, we'll have that division stood up at the Safety Center, and we'll be producing results hopefully next year at some point, sir.
Thank you, Admiral. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Panetta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, good morning, and thank you for being here. Major General Rauch, you, in your testimony, you submitted information and basically differentiated in regards to the mishap rate between manned and unmanned rates. However, Admiral Leavitt and General Francis, you did not. Can you provide this data, or do you know now whether or not there are any trends between manned and unmanned mishaps that you can talk to right now?
Sir, I'll have to take that for the record. I don't have those stats in front of me.
Affirm. Thank you.
And sir, we'll get back to you with those statistics as well.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And then in regards to, let's see, General Francis, you did a good job in your testimony pointing out the need to train in regards to large-scale combat operations. However, you go on to say this operational tempo challenges our ability to achieve collective level training standards above the platoon level. Now, obviously, as you know well, the NDAA, we authorized a pretty big budget, and if we can't train to large-scale combat operations under this record budget, you know, what are we doing wrong? What else do we need to do in your recommendation?
Congressman, thank you for the question. This would be more for the Army G3 to answer, but the operational tempo can deploy units at less than that collective level. And so as we deploy, we actually can sometimes consume readiness depending on how we deploy our aviation forces. So it's not that our aviation forces aren't flying and training, but training to that, but the battalion collective level for large-scale combat operations is what a challenge for us right now with this operational tempo.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Gentlemen, I look forward to continuing the conversation as we move along. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm trying to get a feel for military versus commercial, and it's like comparing apples and oranges with substantial differences between the two, obviously. Let me give some background, and then I'm going to ask some questions. And I've gone through your submitted testimonies in writing, and commercial airliners typically look at fatal accidents per 1 million flights, while the military data that you've given us is on a basis of 100,000 flight hours. If we were to assume, and I recognize that this makes the military numbers look better because most commercial flights are longer than an hour, but if we were to assume 1 hour per commercial flight and transform your numbers, which are on a 100,000 basis, to a million basis, then this is, generally speaking, what we get. With commercial airliners, they're averaging about 0.25 fatal accidents per million flights, versus the Army's roughly 0.99, if I understood your testimony correctly, per 100,000 flight hours, multiplied times 10 gives us 9.9. So the military is having fatality rates that are much higher than what we see in the commercial sector. And the Air Force numbers, if I understand the difference between the Air Force and Army, is the Air Force has a fatality rate that is a little bit, or Class A mishap rate, that is a little bit higher than the Army's. So that's kind of a background. And looking at some of the factors as I understand them, but if you're aware of other factors, please illuminate. You've got the types of aircraft, and you've got the argument that the military aircraft are much more complex, and they're operated by fewer individuals, hence there's smaller room for error. You've got, with military aircraft, you're almost continually testing the limits of those aircraft in order to be combat ready, where you'd be expected to do the same thing. That, of course, is not what commercial pilots do. Perhaps there is a difference in experience of pilots, where, by way of example, a lot of military pilots, when they retire, they become commercial airline pilots. That's their second career, so they've already got all that military experience built in, then they add on to it. And then you've got the maintenance issue, and I don't know how often or how much maintenance work is done by the military versus commercial, and there may be other factors, but those are four that come to mind. So with all this as a backdrop, which factors do you believe are most responsible for the Class A mishaps in your various services? And then second, what can we do to help?
And just a note, I appreciate that the gentleman's questions were not to them with respect to a comparison of commercial versus military, but I do want to note that they were not asked to prepare any data or information with respect to commercial versus military, but your questions seem to be pretty much targeted toward just their current role, so I appreciate that.
Congressman, thanks for the question. As the broad overlay, we do spend time with the civilian aviation community. Some of the type of flying we do is close to that, the actual flying itself, and so we pay attention to the safety forums that they have and are on some of those boards so that we can learn some of the things they do. If industry drives forward with some sort of a safety program, data gathering or some sort of analysis, we try and learn from that and bring it on as quick as we can. From the Air Force's point of view, you talked about the different mission set, and that's exactly the case for us. It's all the way from helicopters to fighters to cargo to ISR and everything in between. So a completely different set of missions that are required. So while the airline is traveling from point A to point B, we often have some mission that's going on in between. We also have aircraft that are significantly older than the normal commercial fleet, which drives increased maintenance, as you addressed, and those are probably the two of the largest features for us.
So one thing that we can do to help would be to buy newer aircraft.
The environment that we live in with aging aircraft and the engineering that's required to sustain those aircraft in the more time, we're certainly setting up hazards there that have to be mitigated, if not, sir.
Admiral Leavitt or General Francis?
Sir, thanks for the question. I would offer along the lines of what General Rauch said. I think the mission in and of itself is much more inherently risky as we go forward, and being able to consistently train and do things along those lines would be helpful to be able to keep our training. As you know, the Navy uses tiered readiness as we get ready to deploy. The OFRP cycle, the Optimized Fleet Readiness cycle, is a 36-month cycle for our carrier strike groups. We spend some of that time in the maintenance basic phase, then we get into the advanced phase, and then we deploy and sustain afterwards. And it's that training ramp along the way that gets people up to speed so they can be certified to deploy.
Thank you for the question, sir. Sir, I'm very proud of what we ask our Army aviators to do. We ask these young aviators to operate in adverse weather, in unimproved conditions. They're not landing on runways. Our Army aviators are landing in the dirt, in dust, in various challenging environments. They're up against an enemy force. They're working in coordination with a ground force. So the complexity of what military, especially Army aviation, does in conjunction with a ground force compared to a civilian airline is really apples and oranges. And so it goes back to training. You asked, what are the causal factors? I think we've already talked about that the 76% or so of our mishaps are human factors related, about 19% are materiel related. And so going after that biggest part of that, which is training, particularly for large-scale combat operations, is our primary focus.
So as I understand it, the two main things, newer aircraft, more money for more time for training. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. O'Halloran?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. I'd like to go back to the Air Force issue first, Mr. General, and identify, it seems that there's three different kinds of boards. And does everybody talk to one another about maybe which one is more adept at making sure that we get to an answer sometime before in some of the major issues, 2, 3, 4, whatever amount of years it is? Because, and what happens in that intervening period to make sure that the issue is resolved for the safety of the pilots in that intervening period? So right to left, please.
Congressman, thank you. Yes, so first off, we are underneath the OSD umbrella of what needs to be investigated. Our mishap investigation boards are pretty similar. The training or background or where we pull them from is slightly different, with the exception of if we have a standing board. To not consume time, there were some details that we left out. For us, for example, when a board goes to investigate, they're tasked with coming to resolution in 30 days. So that time pressure is there for them to find out what's happened within 30 days. Then there's some time after that for them to actually get to the convening authority and brief it and have it accepted. In that 30 days, at the very beginning, if they find some time-critical safety item that needs to be fixed, whether it's identifying a problem with a part that they discover, a way an aircraft's maintained, a way it's operated, pretty much the spectrum, there's ways within the service to go out and get that to the fleet immediately, because we don't want that type of aircraft or maybe the entire Air Force to be operating with that same hazard. Once something gets identified, if it's a time-critical item, it'll go out that way. So,
Admiral?
Yes, sir, thank you. Very similar procedures to what the Air Force does when it comes to their boards. Because we're an expeditionary force, and a lot of times it would be very hard to get somebody out to the ship or out to an austere Marine Corps expeditionary facility. That's why we draw internally from our own folks to comprise the board. Additionally, once the board meets, they as well have 30 days to get the information out, and then from there it goes through the endorsing chain. I call them information off-ramps, but along the way there's off-ramps to get the information out to the fleet via hazard reports or near-miss reports or things along those lines to get the information back out to the fleet well before the investigation report itself is done. I hope that answers your question, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, sir. The Army, as we said, has standing investigation boards that are packed and ready to deploy on a moment's notice. So getting to the scene and beginning an investigation is not generally an issue for us. Even in remote places, we can get there pretty quickly. At any time in our investigation, we determine there's an issue that affects the entire fleet of aircraft or the Army or other users, potentially other services or even other countries. We do not wait for the completion of an investigation to get after that problem. We immediately convene a panel with all of the correct technical experts to make sure that we're addressing the issue, be it material, training, whatever the case may be, and getting after it immediately. Then we have communication mechanisms that gets that word out to every aviation unit and aircraft user across the force, with foreign cases and with our joint services as well, very, very rapidly if there's a safety of flight. And that's generated by our Airworthiness Authority.
and this would be for anybody, but how do we close this window? The 2, 3, 4, we have pilots up there. If we find the part that's wrong, and we fix it. But in some cases, obviously, it takes investigation. How do we close that window so that the safety of the pilots and the aircraft itself is at a level that's reliable for those pilots to get into within a year or within the shortest amount of time possible?
Congressman, if I understand the question correctly, there's really two ways we go after that. One is flying aircraft that are already airworthy. We're looking to maybe extend the timeline of it. So there's a lot of engineering and non-destructive inspection and that sort of thing that goes on to try and identify that flaw or hazard to do something to the fleet before it ever comes up. And if they discover something, some time critical, time order change will go out to make that. And if it is something that is very high risk, there'll be decisions about whether they'll even fly that airplane. We might end up standing it down. The same thing happens right after a mishap occurs. Oftentimes, operationally, you'll see the commander decide to elect not to fly that platform until they can get a little bit of a sense of what just happened. Obviously, there's a lot of other good reasons for that, too. You just have an organization that suffered some sort of mishap and a loss, and you want to make sure that you've got everything squared away and can look your folks in the face. That's right.
Thank you. I yield.
Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony today and your service to the country. So I note that over the last 2 weeks alone, the Air Force has halted flights of F-15s in Japan and stood down B-1 operations worldwide. These are just the most recent in a long line of reports about aviation issues across the services. And while we did not lose pilots in these recent incidents, Congress is deadly serious about ensuring the safety of our service members. So that's why I applaud this and support Ranking Member Smith's initiative for an independent aviation commission to take an objective and an apolitical look at the root causes of these mishaps and work to identify actionable steps that the department can take. So my question is, how will these types of initiatives help us to turn lessons learned into best practices and at the same time with increased speed, agility, and confidence?
Sir, thank you for the question. One thing I'll add about your lessons learned piece and things along those lines. The three of us here, as well as the Coast Guard, participate in what's called the Joint Service Safety Council. And we meet biannually to discuss things in person, but our staffs and action officers exchange data, lessons learned, and best practices for common problems and issues, as well as common airframe types when we discover something between them. So there's a joint effort between us and the Coast Guard as well to address the lessons learned and make them best practices across the services.
Okay, thank you. And I'm really curious as to how we balance what seems to be a very bureaucratic accident review process with the need to maintain readiness. For example, a board is going through the investigation process and identifies a problem. Since 1 point does not make a line and 2 points don't make a trend, how do they determine if it's a systemic problem where an action item needs to be disseminated to everyone, or if it was just a unique combination of factors that were specific to that incident?
Thank you, Congressman. The boards are actually tasked to do just that, to dig into it, to find out, what exactly specifically happened in this time. And so the recommendations will come from there. And you're exactly right that sometimes if you see more than one recommendation coming from a place, they've got access to past investigations for us off of our databases and that sort of thing to help identify that very early on. If they identify that there's a problem with just the mechanical piece on just one jet, they will go to the actual sustainment center or organization for that and see if that's a systemic piece or part to it. But you're exactly right. From each individual mishap, they're tasked with finding the purpose and the root cause of that individual mishap. It's the analysis that happens afterwards that you're exactly right to go to see what other things that could be related to that is a little bit more difficult.
And if it's found to be systemic, how quickly is that disseminated, though, across the services?
If it's systemic about a part on an airplane or something like that,
right,
it's that day we're talking. We have a mishap of a T-38. in this case, we end up calling NASA right away just to let them know before we even know anything that happened with it, to give them the heads up so that we can establish that communication. And we do the same thing with the sister services as it relates to that.
Okay, thank you. And my understanding is that once an investigation is complete, the board produces a report accepting or rejecting potential causal factors, after which the report's endorser, usually a flag or a general officer, can generally agree or disagree with the report. How often is there disagreement between the board and the endorser, and what are the most common reasons for the disagreement?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Since I've been in this job, there has not been a disagreement between the legal investigation and the safety investigation. It has occurred in the past, and sometimes that's simply because the safety board may have access to some information that the legal investigation did not have, or there may be just a difference of opinion on the causal factors if it is unable to be determined. So I don't see that as a big issue. I have not seen it in particular in the Army.
Okay. And my last question that I have here is, while we've increasingly moved to unmanned systems and are actively working towards autonomous systems in multiple domains, unmanned and autonomous systems can analyze information faster than humans and can operate under physical conditions that humans could not. And artificial intelligence has beaten up pilots in multiple flight simulator trials. With aviation mishaps on the rise, do you feel that this is going to hasten acquisition and utilization of these unmanned and autonomous systems? And do you feel that they will see an increased role in the future of combat aviation?
Congressman, thanks for that question. As we started to look through the human factors pieces of what might be coming next, it really is what may be the human factors that are involved with something that's closer to semi-autonomous in the system. And so you let part of the airplane do some level of work for you. We already have that in the most rudimentary of algorithms that run or whatever else. But as it gets smarter and smarter, how do you bring that on, and how do we make sure that the human factors that either doesn't overwhelm the aircrew or that it does exactly what they want in the conditions they want? And so the first part is probably going to be, how do we interact with something that's semi-autonomous, that's doing some of the work for us? That next step is one of the ones that's of interest and folks are looking at as we look at artificial intelligence and that sort of thing. But automating the system is another realm, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much. I know my time's expired, but appreciate your testimony today, and I yield back.
Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to have a couple questions. Number one, what specific platforms are of most concern for future incidents or mishaps? Any ones in particular that we should particularly be looking at? We'll start with Brigadier General.
So did you say patterns?
No, apologize, platforms.
Platforms. In the Army, we do not have a specific platform that indicates to us that there's a particular problem. We have various sizes of fleets for Apaches, Chinooks, and Blackhawks, but none of them are indicating to us that we have one problem in one particular area.
Okay. Admiral?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. What we've discovered through some studies, both two independent studies that were done independently of each other, assisted with contractors for the Marine Corps and the Navy, and we discovered that there are Class C aviation ground mishaps, primarily maintenance evolutions, towing of airplanes, dropping things on airplanes, and things along those lines. Within the Navy and Marine Corps, the two highest density communities are our MH-60 Seahawk fleet and our FA-18 fleet is where we've seen the most number of mishaps. In the Marine Corps, it's been with the MV-22 and F-18 as well. We don't single those platforms out as necessarily having problems. It's because we're having an increase in Class C mishaps, and that's the preponderance of the fleet for both services, sir.
Makes sense.
Thank you, Congressman. And we haven't identified a specific fleet that is worse than the others, but there are hazards across the spectrum, and so with the aging fleets, that are that aged, we're looking at what it takes to sustain those and what hazards that creates. Bringing new systems on, we're looking at what does it take to absorb and learn that new system and train to it, and so each one has some peculiar hazards that exist that have to be mitigated.
And holding that thought, is age the issue here? Because I mean, it's just me, but it looks like what we see happening is on some of the older airframes, for example, like the B-52 or U-2, you rarely hear about any problems with that. And then newer platforms, we actually do have more problems. Is there something going on about how things were made or different training cycles that have evolutionized how people actually are able to take care of these platforms?
Congressman, I think there's really two parts to that. There's a lot of work that it's required to keep an aged aircraft, flying as time goes on. So a lot of extra maintenance that goes into it, the engineering support and that sort of thing. So there is a lot of work that goes on there. Those sort of things that are found ahead of time and somebody does something about it doesn't necessarily hit the news cycle. Then on the more modern aircraft, we do have a situation where if it's a 5th generation fighter or some others, that the engine components and some other things are more expensive to those, and especially the first couple times you have a mishap, it takes a little longer to figure out what the cost to replace that piece. And so on some of the newer aircraft, you're also seeing that, and that's why some of them pop out. And on our system, and you look at when we dive into our mishaps for Class A rates, there's more that are of that system that if it was an older airplane would not have risen to the same level of damage, so it would not have been the same sort of mishap, sir.
Okay. I yield back.
Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to each of you for being here today. To begin with, I wonder if any of you have any programs in place that use artificial intelligence or other basic data analytics tools that might help detect possible issues before they occur. General?
So we do not have that. We are moving towards that right now. Much like the Navy, with working with the Army Analytics Group, we're developing what we call the Army Safety and Occupational Health Enterprise Information Management System that will incorporate that, and that we'll start feeling that in the beginning of 19.
Okay, Admiral?
Yes, sir. Thanks for the question. I spoke earlier about partnering with Army Analytics and the fleet and type commanders out there to obtain their data, to collaboratively share data and come up with deep dive analytic tools. Additionally, we're moving from our legacy safety reporting system, which is called the Web-Enabled Safety System, which was fielded in about 2006, and we're moving to what's now called RMI, Risk Management Information. We're actually partnering with the Air Force using their AFSAS, Air Force Safety Automated System, and we're creating our data fields in there, and we're populating that. Within AFSAS by itself, there will be a couple tools, business intelligence tools, that will be able to just mine data at the squadron level, ship level, individual unit level, to take a look at how they're doing compared to other units and things along those lines. That's kind of the less deep dive stuff, and Army Analytics is going to be where we're going to get the big bang for the buck, sir.
Okay. Sir?
And as discussed, sir, that automated system for us that we stood up in 2007, moved to the cloud in 2014, about 370,000 records that are in there. And so we have this layer of analytic tools that are there, but what we were also craving is access to other data and then things to handle big data analytics and that sort of thing. And so although we have a level of analytics that are there, we definitely want to ramp that up, sir.
Okay, thanks for that. General Francis, I'd like to commend you on the Army's lowest 3-year period of mishaps. In your testimony, you stated that most mishaps are the result of a series of events. First of all, does the Army investigate different mishaps depending on the initial cause, or is it more of a blanket approach?
No, the Army investigates all mishaps. Regardless of the severity, we investigate all of them. And regardless of what we suspect is the underlying causal factor, we investigate them all. That's how we get the data that we do have.
Okay. And how are mishap reviews prioritized, and do different causes play a part in that prioritization?
It's really prioritized by severity. So the Combat Readiness Center, we won't necessarily go out and use one of our centralized investigation teams to investigate a Class D mishap, for instance. We will go do the most severe Class A's, and it's usually associated with a fatality when we use our particular team. So they're prioritized primarily on severity versus any other category.
Are certain causes any more prevalent than others?
Yes, human factors comprise about 76% of our current mishaps, and about 19% are material failure. So we track those, and that ratio has been pretty consistent over the 35 years that Army Aviation has been a branch.
Okay. General Francis, the global security environment is obviously changing rapidly. As we transition away from counterinsurgency and strictly air-to-ground tactics into larger-scale operations, is the mishap review process shifting accordingly?
Yes, what we're doing is trying to go from being reactive to more proactive. In other words, we're taking a look at where we have suffered the most Class A mishaps in previous conflicts, and we have experienced those in conflicts like Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Bosnia and Kosovo, and Iraq and Afghanistan. So as we sit here today, as the Army prepares for large-scale combat operations, we are looking very hard at what can we do to get after the problem now before we get launched into another conflict that may cause us to have that spike, and what can we do to prevent that now?
Okay, and my last question is, you noted in your testimony that less severe mishaps are downgraded to review by local entities with, quote, abbreviated requirements. Does this more minor threshold of review lead to less effective results or recommendations?
No, it does not. It simply means that they have less of a requirement to report that to higher levels with a formal briefing. We still get all the data from those mishaps to conduct analysis with.
Okay, I want to make sure that abbreviated requirements doesn't necessarily lead to less thorough reviews.
No, it does not.
Okay, with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today. I wanted to begin with Rear Admiral Leavitt and ask you this: as we look at our Navy air assets, and we know that when the demand signal goes out, the first question is, where are the aircraft carriers? How do we get them to the fight? I want to make sure we understand with that the risk that our naval aviators are facing. And I just wanted to get you to give us a distinction about how the different levels of investigations happen when we have these crashes. Is there a difference when there's a fatality involved? Is it something different if it just causes, an emergency landing? Is it different if it occurs at sea than on the land? Are there different levels about how you do that evaluation? Do you risk rate that? Give us some indication about what urgency is placed on these investigations, and then the urgency placed on what the follow-up corrective actions would be.
Congressman, thanks for the question. Like the other services, all accidents are investigated. If it is the most serious accident, either in cost of lives or damage to an airplane, they have the largest priority. Every accident is investigated by a accident investigation board and a trained aviation safety officer. There is no difference in the investigation process itself. The idea is to prevent this mishap from happening again in the future. When it comes to corrective actions in the endorsement chain well, let me go back. If something's identified immediately that it's a bad part on an airplane or there's a training procedure out there that's wrong, and an immediate hazard report will go out that identifies the problem, and it goes to NAVAIR, who's our airworthiness authority, and if they determine it's an airworthiness issue, they'll what's called red stripe the fleet, which means it puts that entire type model series of airplanes out of service until they can come up with a corrective action for it. But from there, outside of something that pops up immediately, the endorsement chain, as it goes up, if it's a Class A, it makes it all the way to the Naval Safety Center, and the commander of the Naval Safety Center endorses that for CNO. B's, C's, and D's go up to the endorsement level where the individual has the authority to affect the corrective actions for what that mishap report came out with. So it may just go to AirLant or Naval Air Forces or Sinatra or one of those individuals to initiate the corrective action for the issue, sir.
Gotcha. Thanks. I was just concerned about making sure there's consistency, especially in how we respond to those. Brigadier General Francis, I wanted to ask a question about how investigations occur in what I see as a bifurcated way. We're already, almost halfway through 2018, where we already have 20 people dead in 2018 mishaps. The thing that concerns me is, I understand the need for us to have safety privilege protections, but it seems like to me that we have a two-tiered system. One where we incentivize aviators to come in and give a full account of what happened in that and say, listen, do that, no legal ramifications. And then afterwards, we have a formal investigation that says, by the way, be careful what you say, don't disclose anything because there are legal ramifications to that. How do we really get at the root of these issues if you say one thing at one point in the investigation, said, we want your really honest opinion about what's happening, and then later on when we get to the formal process, we say, by the way, there are all kinds of legal ramifications to what you may give us. Give us your perspective about how somehow that serves the better purpose of really getting to the root of these mishaps.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. That's exactly why we have this thing called safety privileged information.
Yeah.
Okay, those involve witness statements and so forth so that we can, in fact, get that unadulterated view of what happened for the purpose of loss prevention. The purpose of the other investigation is a different purpose, and anyone who is a subject of one of those investigations has all the legal rights associated with those investigations. So I don't necessarily see it as a bifurcated system, but one that preserves our ability to get after safety privilege information that helps us with loss prevention.
But doesn't one affect the other? Doesn't one where you say, hey, be honest and forthright with us and don't worry about it. We're going to make sure that we privilege that information, yet later they're going to be in a formal investigation where they know that what they say could have legal ramifications for them. I still see that in one you're asking them to be truthful, and the other you're essentially the incentives are to be tight-lipped.
I haven't seen that as being a concern. We also have the ability to give safety privilege to a specific individual, saying that we will not, even in a FOIA request, I will guarantee that we will not submit your statement to anyone or anywhere so that we can, in fact, get that information. So we have not experienced that, a problem with either one of those investigations competing with one another or causing a change of information.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Zongas for a follow-up question?
Well, as we've been hearing today, it's clear that all the services have large safety organizations, and over time, like other parts of the military, you've come under budget pressures as well, and so your funding priorities and amounts have to change. So over the past 10 years, how have resources changed in your service? Do you have more people, less? What about funding levels? Are they adequate? And most especially, are there any areas of the safety enterprise where we are taking risks we shouldn't because of these constraints? So we'll start on the right and move to the left here.
Okay, ma'am. As we talk about funding levels, so the Safety Center has funds, and me as part of the air staff get funded that way. And so the entire safety enterprise, though, is much, much larger than that, right? So there's safety organizations, and it's really a commander's program. And so operational maintenance accounts pay for some day-to-day safety things that are spread throughout the entire enterprise. And then the preventive engineering type work that happens in the program offices to identify what it takes to extend the life of an aircraft safely is, at least from our point of view, something that also goes towards safety. And so it's hard to wrap around what all those items are. I can tell you that from the account that individually goes to pay for the Safety Center, for example, this year is the best year in the last 10 years for funding for the Air Force. We've been able to go after more of the initiatives that we wanted to do inside the Safety Center. But as a member of that, over the years, we have had both plus-ups. In the last 10 years, we've had both plus-ups and reductions in manning levels within the Safety Center as the staffs were forced to cut manpower, ma'am.
So do you see an area where you're absorbing risks that you worry about?
What I see us doing is in a time when we were very, very busy responding to current mishaps, that you may not have the forces you'd like to have to be able to do some of the proactive things that you are able to do, because, of course, the mishaps don't happen in a steady rate, unfortunately, for at least the workload. So, yes, we had more manpower before, which allowed you to do more initiatives, but we have enough folks to do the things that we're doing now. And so really it is how much hazards can you mitigate, and how do you go after those proactive things do you want that you want to do, ma'am?
The more hazards that you're having to investigate, the more thinly you're stretched.
Yes, ma'am.
Admiral.
Yes, ma'am, and I'll speak strictly for the Naval Safety Center and not the enterprise writ large, but much like General Rauch said, there are things at Naval Air Systems Command and things like that, extending airplanes, doing engineering investigations and things like that that are affected by funding. But the Naval Safety Center itself over the last 10 years has remained fairly constant, and as we take on new tasks in our knowledge management safety promotion area, we're actually in a growth mode right now over the next several years. We got a plus up in funding in 18, we'll get one in 19, and we're palming for some additional manpower to assist in our data analytics for 20. So one issue that we have seen is our operational aviation safety assessments, where our teams go out and assess different units along the way. Sometimes when funding gets tight, we cut back on the number of those that actually go out and do that, but we have a program in place where we can identify at-risk squadrons and high-performing squadrons. So we try to look at those specifically and take the best practices from the high-performing squadrons and try to inculcate that into our at-risk squadrons and move from there.
General.
Thank you, ma'am. So we are adequately funded and resourced to do the mission that we're required to do. Over the last 5 years, we have had a decrease in personnel we were asked to say, how can we do this more efficiently, just like everybody else is challenged to do in tough times. And we designed the organization that we thought best did that. As we have now executed using that new organization, we've identified probably two places where we need to reshore up. One is our analytic capability, and then the other is our investigation capability. So we do have enough teams to support our requirements right now in terms of accident investigation, but our analytic capability has gone down. So not only are we going to go back to the Army and compete for those spaces if we compete well for them, but we're looking at other assets like Army Analytics Group to help us with that analysis, and we think that's going to be a very strong partnership that will help us to do that.
So until that happens, do you feel that's an area where you are absorbing a level of risk that worries you?
It does not worry me. We're not missing anything. It's taken us a little bit longer than we'd like right now to get to some of the analytics, but certainly on urgent things, we're not seeing a risk to the force or to the Army right now with our ability right now. But we do want to expand that capability to look deeper into some areas.
Thank you. I yield back.
Solomon, thank you for your testimony. We've had great participation by members of the committee. This is going to be a beginning of a series of hearings that we will be having, looking at all aspects of how this issue is managed. I'm certain that we'll be returning to you again and your expertise, but we greatly appreciate both your commitment to this issue and the insight that you provided us today. Thank you. We'll be adjourned.
Sam.